Thank you, and thank you, Julie, for asking me to do this. And Julie actually asked me to go last, I think, in order to avoid redundancy where possible, because she's heard my sort of spiel before. And I think, I'm really amazed at how much what I do is like what Mark does, down to the 90 to 100, 80 to 89.999, et cetera. So I'll say just a little bit about that. As what Mark was saying, for me and for my colleagues in the history department, and I think increasingly for several of the colleagues in the arts faculty whose rubrics I've recently had the pleasure of looking at, I think we at least would all say that those numbers are arbitrary, right? We're interested in what equals an A, and the 95 or an 85 for a B or whatever is entirely for convenience, because at the end of the day we want to be able to average something out. And so if a student were to say to me, wow, that's so demanding because some other professor has a 75 as the minimum for an A, I would say, you want a 75 to be my minimum? I could do that, but it won't make a difference because I will just change the, it matches the criteria, it doesn't match the number. So again, I think there are two basic issues we have to address, and one of them really hasn't been addressed yet today, but it's one that I think Jim is already thinking about. The first one is the mechanics, and I think that's what we're talking about today. The second one is the implication of how do we maintain any kind of reasonable standards if it's a free-for-all that everybody kind of does what they want to do. And I'll say a little bit about that in a second. But when Julie first asked me to participate today, my first thought was, is there even an issue? What's the issue? Because I don't see that I've ever, for any reason, converted a rubric grading to a final grade. I just haven't ever done that because it's unnecessary. Because when I designed the rubric, I started with articulating every single criterion for every single assignment, and at the end of the day, I use the rubric for grading, and that produces a grade, and then I put that grade into the system, and so I haven't actually had to do a converting because the use of the rubric itself created the grade, right? But I have become aware that there are other ways of doing rubric design. So I'm going to say what I do, again, not knowing to what extent you're constrained by your department, not knowing to what extent you have your own freedom to do whatever kinds of rubrics you want to do. But essentially what I do, and I think this is basically what other members of the history department do, and what probably about 50 to 60% of the arts faculty colleagues do. I just, at the very beginning, articulate for every assignment, and in some cases for each component within every assignment, what constitutes an A, what constitutes a B, what constitutes a C, and so on. And by the way, I shouldn't say and so on, because I use all 5 letter grades, okay? I'm one of those Americans that Paul was talking about. I use all 5 letter grades. And then it's all about the weighting. And my weighting, one assignment counts 25%, one counts 40%. I've never had an assignment count 40%. But the weighting is based on my view of how important it is as an assignment and also how much time I want the students to put into it. So I don't think it's arbitrary, although there's a little bit of arbitrariness to it probably. It's not an exact calculation. I would never make something count for 23.758% of, so it's rounded, right? But so then articulating, I guess in some, I didn't bring rubrics because my presentations about rubrics are still on the webpage. You can watch them, et cetera. In some cases, I use holistic rubrics where, for example, this short essay, the following 4 components would equal an A range, the following 5 components would equal a B range, whatever. In other cases, I break it down into 3 or 4 categories, such as articulation of the argument, use of evidence, organization and structure, writing style, things like that. But purely for convenience reasons, I articulate numbers for every one of these things that correspond to eventually my 90 to 100% grading scale. So for example, if there's an assignment in which I articulate that 30% is about use of evidence, then the highest category, outstanding, of use of evidence, full score would be 30. So basically I say outstanding would be 27 to 30, because if you do the math, 27 out of 30 is 90%. So my point is, all along, I'm communicating to students how I weigh the importance of this assignment relative to the other assignments you're doing. Well, obviously, if one counts 20% of your grade and one counts 10% of the grade, that's double, right? And then all along, I communicate to the students how I value this component within the assignment compared to others. If two of them each count 30%, then I'm weighing them equally. Again, that could be arbitrary. Should I count evidence as exactly the same as argument and count both 3 times as much as writing style? I don't claim that that's handed down by, by God to Moses. That's not my point. But the point is, I've communicated to the students so the students know that this is what I'm expecting from them and this is how I'm going to assess it. And so then it really is just a matter of entering the grades into the Excel spreadsheet. And at the end, much like Mark said, I've done exactly the same thing. So I guess I am a soft-hearted American after all. I often lower eventually, like in the Common Core class, A- became 87, not 90, right? And the lowest D, instead of following the 60 that I articulated to them. And by the way, I didn't announce this to the students, but the final D became 55, not 60. So I tended to lower it to where there was an obvious cutoff. I didn't make it 55 because somebody had a 55.01 and somebody had a 54.99, and I could just put it in. I put it where there was a reasonable threshold where maybe there were 3 or 4 points separating students. Now, oddly enough, what I found, because I've been on Senate for many years, I think I'm not going to be going forward probably for a while, but I've been on Senate for many years, and every year at the last meeting, after we send the students and the observers out of the room, we get to see the GPAs of all the programs. We get to see the final graduation numbers. And I'm aware that as we've had the norming, we've still had some programs that have had average GPA of 3.15, and some programs have had average GPA of 2.77 or whatever. So we've already got a wide variation. When we first were starting to go to the criterion referencing, we had maybe a false start a few years ago because we were told it was going to happen, and then we didn't do it for about 7 years. But what I first heard a lot of department heads say is, what about rigor? What about standards? Because I have members of my department, faculty members, who will say to me, but all the students did great in my class, so that's why I'm giving 85% A's. And he was able to say, I'm thinking of one person in particular, but actually several people have told this to me. He was able to say, no, there's a norm. You have to lower some of them. If we get rid of that, how am I going to tell them that they have to lower some of them? Well, my answer to that would be, if a student actually achieves the articulated criteria for an A, they should get an A, full stop. And that means every student gets an A, they should all get A's. That's never actually happened to me, not even close. Ask any of the Common Core students. But what I would say in response to that is it's all about the level of the standards that you set in the criteria themselves. And I would suggest knowing our student body, knowing the JUPA scores they come in with, et cetera, if you ever were giving 80% A's, you probably need to take an honest look in the mirror and say, I'm not giving university level criteria. Yes, they achieved the criteria. Who wouldn't achieve those criteria? They were easy. That's why they achieved them. But as that department head I'm thinking of came back and said to me, yeah, but that's an awful lot of work. So now what I'm predicting is that the wide range we have between departments, among departments, already under norming, that wide range is going to very quickly get even wider unless departments, unless programs have very specific mechanisms for reining that in. And there may actually be even ideological differences from one department to the next. At my last job, I was next door to the education department, and we actually all knew each other's grades because the registrar circulated that among us. And she had 20 students. That's all she taught. And she had 20 A's. And I said, that's not university level. And she said, but they all met the criteria. Well, in the history program, we didn't have those kind of grades. So I think this is where the working group that Jim is working with, on academic standards, is going to have to address some of these issues. But I see that as the great elephant in the room. is at a university level, what's going to happen when some professors are giving 85% A's or 60% A's, and some are not giving very many A's. It's going to really make for the students getting really upset and outraged. Now, again, as far as the mechanics, I didn't really have a lot to add because I do very similar to what Mark does, even though I think we may have gotten there from different directions, but we both got it via America. But my own personal view, if you have the freedom to design your own rubrics, you completely eliminate that question of how do I convert if you just start from the very beginning by articulating that, you know, this is equal to an A, this is equal to a B, and you actually embed them in your rubrics themselves. That's clear to the students, that's clear to you, and at the end you don't convert anything, you simply record the grades that you've yourself assessed over the course of the whole semester. So thank you, that's I think all I have to say.